Hello and welcome to the Our Civil Liberties in a Post-COVID World webinar. My name is Ahmed Keskin and I'm the Executive Director of the Australian Intercultural Society. For those of you joining us for the first time, the AIS is a not-for-profit organisation established in a pre-9/11 world with a view of strengthening mutual respect and understanding between people of diverse communities through meaningful engagement. This program is an example of this endeavour as the AIS, as we refer to it, has partnered with Liberty Victoria to bring you this event. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands upon which we gather and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to inform you of an upcoming program, one that we're very proud to have been partnering with for the last 4 years. This was our 5th partnership, and that's with Equal Employment Opportunity Network to bring you this year's conversation titled Conversations from the Heart, which will be a reflective look at 2020 and focus on the challenges and learnings made to date. And it promises to be a very informative discussion and very robust discussion. And that will be held on Wednesday, the 9th of December. Look out on our website and the Equal Employment Opportunity Network's website for further details, as that will guide you to where you could register. All of these programs could be found on the AIS website, which is www.intercultural.org.au. Moving on to this program, the panel aims to provide insightful information on how our civil liberties will look in a post-COVID world, considering the pandemic has been an epoch of recent times. Understanding the need for governments to act to get the outbreak under control, the key question is how much of our civil liberties we have enjoyed to date will be compromised once we transition into a COVID normal world. How do we strike a balance between maintaining public health and safety measures against individual freedoms we are used to and expect as constituents in a liberal society? We encourage you to engage with the conversation by asking your questions on the chat section, which is on the YouTube screen. To get the program underway, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Leslie Cannold. Dr. Leslie Cannold is a medical ethicist, an educator and author of non-fiction and fiction works, including the historical novel, The Book of Rachel. She's a member of the Mental Health Tribunal, the Victorian Board of Nurses and Midwifery Board, and the Forensic Leave Panel, and chairs the Ethics Committee for Marie Stopes International, which provides sexual and reproductive health care to disadvantaged women in 37 countries around the world. Leslie also sits on the advisory panel of the AIS and is the Deputy Chair of the Board of the Mental Health Victoria. Thank you, Leslie, for moderating the discussion, and I will now hand over to you.
Thank you, Amit. And of course, my most important role is serving on the advisory panel of the AIS. So look, we do have a really fascinating conversation today. I thank you so much for everyone for tuning in. I think we all know that one of the hallmarks of advanced democracies like Australia has been the protections offered by governments of our individual liberties. So things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom from arbitrary arrest and assembly amongst the liberties that we have enjoyed. And I think for many of us prior to COVID-19 and the lockdowns, we largely probably took some of them for granted. So lockdowns and other restrictions on the freedom of individual Australians have happened within the framework. They have happened within a legal framework provided by state emergency acts and Commonwealth biosecurity laws. These laws have never or rarely been used in Australia. And so few of us were really aware of the extraordinary powers that they confer on the state's chief health officer and the Commonwealth Minister for Health. On the 2nd of August, a state of disaster was also declared in Victoria under the Emergency Management Act 1986, and that gave police greater powers to enforce public health directions, something that we last saw in regional Victoria in 2011-2012 in response to floods. When emergency laws are invoked in a constitutional democracy, it is inherently problematic. Emergency powers raise vexing questions about the proper balance between public health and safety and individual freedoms. In a federal legal system such as Australia, they also present challenges regarding the distribution of power between the nation and the state legislatures. Though in the past, and now I'm going to refer to the authors of Emergency Powers in Australia, these have always been resolved with the termination of the special powers that permit basically coercive or authoritarian rule when the public health or safety emergency is over and the restoration of normal. So normal, right? What and when is normal going to come back for us? Which raises the question whether COVID is going to somehow be different. What will COVID normal, the life that's proposed for us, if track and trace continues to be successful until a vaccine arrives? What is COVID normal exactly going to be? And where do our civil liberties fit into it? More importantly, for the evening's conversation, what should COVID normal look like to get the balance right between individual liberties and public health and safety? Luckily, I am joined by people who are going to help us answer what are really, really quite challenging questions. I have with me Julian Burnside, QC, who is the president of Liberty Victoria, best known for his advocacy for human rights and in particular refugee rights, and also former ABC journalist Karen Percy, who is also the vice president of the media section of the MEAA, the Journalists Union. So I'd like to welcome both Julian and Karen to this conversation. I'm really thrilled to have you both here. Thank you so much. Julian, if it's okay, I would like to start with you. Australia and the rest of the world have been in the grip of the COVID-19 pandemic since late February and in various forms of lockdown here in Australia and particularly here in Victoria since mid-March. What are the infringements of individual freedoms during that time that we've experienced? How would, if you would want to kind of canvass what kind of things have happened, and which, if any of them, have alarmed you? Oh, you're on mute.
Sorry.
Great, now we get you.
Okay. The lockdown has meant a variety of things, and it depends on which phase of the lockdown we're talking about, but it has involved such things as a curfew, so limiting the right of movement at various times of evening. It has involved restricting our ability to travel more than 5 or 25 kilometres from our home. It has involved a restriction on the way in which you can have people come to your house or go to their house and so on. Now, all of these restrictions of movement and of socialising are pretty serious restrictions on the sort of liberties we ordinarily expect in a society like Australia. But I must say, independently of the thinking of people at Liberty Victoria, I came to the view that if the sacrifice of individual rights is part of an attempt to defeat something which threatens all of us, then it can be justified. I mean, the classic example is Britain during the Second World War. During the Blitz, people were required either not to have their lights on inside or to have the curtains closed if they had the lights on inside. Now that's an infringement on a person's ordinary rights. But the idea was to help Britain win the war against Germany. Now, as a general proposition, I think that it is reasonable that individual rights should be set to one side if doing so helps you win a war against some other enemy whose conduct threatens all of us. And then you get into some very tricky area about whether the particular rights that are infringed will make any difference at all to the war you're involved in. And
yes, and can I ask you just press a little bit harder on some of those restrictions? So the other kinds of things we've had, for instance, we've had school closures, we've had hard lockdowns in public housing complexes, we've had fines for breaches for peaceful assembly and people being told that they can't actually peacefully assemble to protest different things. Do you still feel the same as you've just described, that all of these things can be justified if they're effective in terms of reducing the spread?
Look, largely the answer is yes. And the reason for that is that obviously individual minds will differ on individual infringements of liberties, and that causes difficulty. But if you look at what's been happening in the US, they have tended to secure the liberties of individual people, and the result has been that they are now one of the, or if not the greatest contributor to COVID deaths per capita in the world. And that, I think, lends some support to the position which has been taken by the Victorian government in particular in relation to these matters.
Okay. Well, they definitely are representing a huge number of the cases, much larger than the percentage of the population they represent.
Yeah.
Karen, you're also on mute, so I'll get you to come off. What are your thoughts about the same question? So what kinds of things have happened during these restrictions that have concerned you, if any? Speak to us about the things that have happened that have worried you, if any have.
I was really shocked when the curfew came in, I have to say. That was something that had not been canvassed. It was not something that had been speculated. But, you know, at the time it came into play, I was kind of go, well, all right, I can understand this because people have clearly been breaching the rules, and that's been leading to spreading and infections. We also had nothing to do anyway. Why would, nobody had a lot of reason to be out. I know that some people who had late night habits felt that they had their rights infringed on. But in the main, we were all kind of paying our way or playing our role. And then, questions started to be asked about what was the health advice behind the curfew, what was the police advice behind the curfew. And it became pretty apparent that there actually wasn't really anything that had informed our health officials about why a curfew had come into place. So I actually got quite mad at that stage, kind of going, seriously, like you need to actually justify this, even though I think it's pretty clear it made a big difference when you restrict movement to that degree. And we went from 700 cases at the end, a daily infection rate at the end of August to, we've now had 5-6 days of zero deaths, zero infections. Like that's pretty astonishing. And a lot of that can come down to the curfew. So I've actually kind of flipped again, if you like, on that, because now we're seeing Europe and parts of the UK imposing curfews. They're imposing all of the things that we were starting to wonder about, 5-kilometre radiuses. There's no doubt that the economic damage that has been done by shutting down Melbourne's economy, whether it's football, restaurants, film festivals, comedy festivals, all of that kind of stuff is going to take a huge amount of effort, time to come back. But I think in terms of actually doing what it set out to do, I think the infringements have been justified and they've worked. And I think we're going to start to see some people with some 20/20 hindsight saying, you know what, I might not have been happy at the time, but now it's a little better. But I want to raise this whole issue of what are our civil liberties here in Australia. I think we make a whole lot of assumptions about what our rights are and what we don't. I went and had a look at the Constitution this morning, and there are in fact only 2 recognised rights within the Constitution for Australians. And that's essentially, it is a section 116, if I recall correctly, which is essentially that the government can't impose a religion upon you, and that that essentially is a freedom of religion, that you have a right to practice any religion that you like. I think there are probably some that may not be entirely true. I think there might be some religions that maybe, I don't know, whether it's the spaghetti monster that you sometimes hear about not being a legitimate. And then there's section 117, which essentially says that if you've got rights in one state or territory of Australia, you actually have to have those rights in another state and territory of Australia. But all of these assumptions we make about equality, about freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, all this kind of stuff are actually parts of other international treaties that we've signed on to, or they've come through other legislation. So I really think Australians have got themselves somewhat confused about what their rights are. We get a whole lot of media and other material from the United States, which has very clearly entrenched rights. And I think some Australians who are going about saying, I don't have to wear a mask and I can go into Bunnings, were actually quite ill-educated about what their rights are here. And we need to have a civics lesson, all of us, about what our rights are, to ensure that when we go into this post-COVID, when there is a COVID normal, that we actually understand what our rights are and can push back better on the kinds of infringements that are likely to come, because when you give governments a little bit, you give them an inch of power, they will take them off.
Okay, so that's a lot, and I'm gonna stop you only because I need to break some of that down. So Julian, I'm just gonna quickly flip back to you. Some of our rights, so Karen's made quite a strong statement that really Australians are kind of confused anyway because we don't actually have that many civil rights. My understanding is that many of our rights are read in or implied. So can you maybe just straighten us out a little bit there? What rights do we have as Australians?
I think our system works on the assumption that the things which ought to be rights are in fact rights. But Karen is exactly correct. They're not protected in the Constitution. There's only 3 jurisdictions in Australia where there are legislative protections of rights. One is Victoria, another is the ACT, and the third is Queensland fairly recently.
Because they have charters. They have charters.
But they're only statutory, not constitutional.
Right.
Karen, you overlooked a third right, which have been implied in the Constitution, and that is the implied right of free political speech. It was Longie's case a few years ago that decided that right existed.
Okay, so we do have a number of rights that and basically freedom of movement, which lockdown goes really to the heart of that really primary right about freedom of movement.
Exactly. It's not a legal right though.
Yes, I hear. That's really interesting. So is that then both of you saying that really we have no grounds to stand on when people say, look, we need to, because the general rule about imposing the kinds of very coercive authoritarian kind of powers that come from the emergency acts and the things I discussed at the beginning, my understanding is that the way that that's supposed to be constrained is that there's rules around them. So they should be necessary. And Karen, you spoke a little bit about kind of, whether certain things were or weren't necessary. Had they been advised? Had they been called for? Was there evidence? Were they justified? They're supposed to be necessary, reasonable, proportional, equitable, non-discriminatory, in full compliance with national and international laws, and time limited. So Julian, I'll ask you first and then I'll come back to you, Karen. Do you think that all our restrictions fit those criterion?
I don't think those criteria exist as a matter of domestic law. I'm going to leave aside what the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities says and the equivalent legislation in the ACT and Queensland. Forget about that. But as a general proposition, I think the simple fact is that what we regard as rights are not rights at all. They're expectations, they're hopes, which guide the conduct of all of us, and in particular, which guide our political response to political behaviour of various sorts.
So were we particularly vulnerable here in Australia to have this kind of very draconian sort of lockdowns we had, particularly here in Victoria, because of this?
I'm tempted to say yes, but I'm slowed down in saying that because the way to get the sort of rights I'm talking about would be by putting it in the federal constitution. America did that in 1879 or a long time ago with the Bill of Rights, the so-called Bill of Rights, and that has done very little to help them in their attempt to combat a global threat. So
I'll chime in here because I was chatting to a friend of mine in the States about exactly this. And one thing that the US states cannot do is independently close their borders. So the states in the US have huge rights and responsibilities and legislative powers to do so much. You only have to look at the fact that we're really looking at 50 separate elections when you're electing the president, but they don't have the right to close their borders. And Australia does have the right to close its borders. And that's what we're seeing at the moment, this push and pull over who's going to open before Christmas to allow families across and the rest of it. So, so I think that's one thing that's quite different. I think you talk about that time limited, and you might recall that the Victorian government actually tried to extend the state of emergency powers, state of disaster powers for 12 months. And were knocked back to 6 and that had to go through the parliament. But a state of emergency and state of disaster in the main allows you to do a whole lot of stuff outside, sort of extra parliamentary, I guess might be one way of putting it, or, it's just outside the usual laws. So it was good to see that the parliament did exercise some of its restraints there to sort of say, you can't put this in indefinitely, this is just not on. But I also think that one of the issues that came about and has really been of concern is the over-policing. Thousands and thousands of fines, pretty hefty fines. A lot of people haven't paid them. My understanding is that, thousands have been put out and fewer than 1,000 have been paid. Will they be pursued? Will the Victorian government actually go after people who were fined for whatever the breaches were? But I also think, we've had years and years, decades even, of, law and order campaigns by successive state governments in different jurisdictions that crime's too high and we need to have law and order kind of campaigns to ensure that we feel safe. And yet when a law and order campaign is turned against ordinary citizens, as we've seen during this pandemic, people don't like it. So I actually think people, and I'm probably going to be a bit controversial here, I think people only really care about civil rights when it suddenly affects them. Australia has been accused of breaching a lot of its international obligations on human rights. Julian would know this about our treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. And we don't have people kind of getting upset in the same way. So I actually think we've become somewhat selfish about, I can't go out and run at 10 o'clock at night and go to Macca's, seriously. I think we really need to rethink things.
Yeah, I've got a couple of really good questions from our listeners, and they flow quite naturally out of this discussion. So if we had an Australian Bill of Rights, would this event that we have just gone through and are going to continue to go through really until there's a vaccine, with this kind of ability, if not actuality, of our rights being, of our perceived rights and our implied rights and our actual rights being curtailed, would that be different if we had an Australian Bill of Rights? Julian, you first and then Karen.
It would be, depending on how that Bill of Rights was framed. But to be honest, I prefer the expression Charter of Rights rather than Bill of Rights, because Bill of Rights makes people think immediately of the American Bill of Rights, and that has had its problems, not least of which the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, which interestingly comes from the English Bill of Rights of a century earlier, which was passed in accepted in 1689, and this is in the wake of the very unpopular James II, and it had a provision which said that for their protection, Protestants have the right to bear arms. Now, you wouldn't get away with that in America, but you see the origins of the Second Amendment.
Yeah. So what kind of Bill of Rights what kind of charter, bill, right document, because I'm not invested and don't have a dog in the fight as to what we call it, but I do have an interest like one of our viewers. How would we construct it so that it would help us? Because it seems to me like the two of you are kind of suggesting that really what's just happened and what will continue to happen until we have a vaccine hasn't really stepped over the line. It's actually been effective, it's worked, it's saved us from the kind of catastrophes that we've seen in the United States, and therefore we have got the balance right.
I would say that we've had one of the test cases in the Supreme Court that also where a business basically said that the shutdown, the lockdown was too much, and that plaintiff lost that. So it was upheld that the health authorities had done the right thing. There are still a number of other test cases going along. I guess for me, a Charter of Human Rights, I don't know that we want it to be too black letter of the law. And that's always been the concern about having a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights, that as soon as you actually articulate things in a fairly strong way, some of the things that we assume we have aren't necessarily there. So there's strength and weakness in having an assumed lot of rights, but, you know, you would expect there would be freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, freedom, you know, equality under the law, the lack of discrimination. All of the things that we do take for granted that, you know, might be in some other parts of legislation. But, you know, people who oppose a Bill of Rights or a Charter of Rights over the decades I've been a journalist are concerned about that black letter. As soon as you write something down, you've inadvertently forgotten something. There's all of that kind of unintended consequences. So, you know, it would have to be very carefully drafted, because as somebody who's been looking at other recent laws in Victoria, looking at some changes to judicial reporting and contempt of court, you know, some of the holes that you can poke through legislation these days, I don't know whether it's sloppy or whether it's intentional, but I think that, you know, when you hand over drafting, and this is nothing to say about you, Julian, but when you hand over to lawyers, you get a legal answer. And I think if we're going to look and go down this path, it actually has to be something that is informed from a lot of different perspectives, not just a legal perspective.
And Julian, can I ask, would it make any difference? Because it seems to me like the way that the State Emergency Acts and the biosecurity laws and the emergency laws, wouldn't they be able to override a Bill of Rights, even if we did, or a charter, even if we did codify one?
If it was a constitutional Charter of Rights, it couldn't be overridden. That's the point about a constitutional right.
I see.
It is,
right.
All legislation should be subject to the Constitution. But just responding to the point Karen made, which I think is a very good point, I think it's important. I agree with you. When you hand things over to lawyers, you can hit problems. But I suspect that a lot of the dodgy legislation we've had in recent times has been because politicians tend to hand over power to the media, not the ABC, but the Mirror press in particular. And that is a problem.
Okay, I'm calling this because this is another conversation, very interesting, but not the one we're having. So I'm calling it. So the one we're having, another very interesting question has come up where somebody has said, look, I'm more than happy to give up. And I would say that this is probably a majority view. I'm happy to give up my personal freedom for the greater good of Australia, for managing the pandemic, protecting vulnerable people, making sure our hospitals function, all of that. But the worry is, and Karen, I think you have gestured at this, so I'll let you go at this first, is that we don't seem to have any kind of independent body or some kind of independent entity that means that when it's over, we get all our rights back.
I think that's true. And, you know, we've got a lot of the so-called quangos, quasi-non-government organisations or supposedly arm's-length organisations. I don't know whether this would be the purview of the ombudsman, for example, or whether we need a special ombudsman to do this kind of thing, where they are running the ruler along a lot of these things. Having a robust parliament and a diverse parliament that has a lot of different voices is really important. And I think in Victoria, we've been lucky to have that. There are some in the upper house who've been able to negotiate some pretty sensible changes to some of this legislation, Fiona Patten being one of those, but not the only one. And I think, you know, in the federal parliament, we also do have some pretty sensible people too, who are just, you know, as that check and balance. You know, despite Paul Keating's unrepresentative swill, you know, they've actually proven to be quite an important part of the process. But you know, we know the Senate makeup is one of those things that is sometimes in the lap of the gods or the preference whisperers. So having some kind of independent body that does run the ruler over these things is really important. But, you know, I guess just an observation of looking at our regulatory bodies and our oversight bodies more generally in Australia, federally and state, they've just been weakened to such a degree that so many of them are just there for lip service. So, you know, creating another one that's just going to rubber stamp things, I think, is really problematic. And that's why I would like to see Australians more generally, if you're talking about civil liberties now, start to think more generally about the pillars of our democracy that are important, not just when they're affecting you individually, but let's look at the media. The media is poorly regulated. The Press Council is deemed to be a toothless tiger, ditto the commercial radio and commercial television regulators. They can't do anything. You complain about coverage in the Murdoch press, and we'll only say that the once, and nothing happens. Ditto if you've got a problem with somebody defrauding you. Like, our regulatory bodies, our checks and balances more generally in our society, in our democracy, are actually really weak. They don't work for people. You'll only have to look at the fuss being put up for an independent anti-corruption commission to know that there's just no serious will to actually make these changes on a political level. So that's when ordinary people, if you're upset about what's been happening now, is actually you have to stand up and be counted, start making complaints. As a former ABC person, when somebody complained about my story, it came through our website. I had to go through hoops and jumps to be able to justify my story and say why it continued to be right. So people need to exercise their duty. It's not just voting. It's not just making a complaint on Twitter. It's actually going through the very boring, administrative, tick lots of boxes to complain about what's happening, whether it's your rights being trampled, whether it's the media that you're not happy about, or the financial regulator really not doing a very good job in handing out pretty poor, low fines for huge defrauding and scams. So we actually have to exercise our rights. We talk a lot about them, but we actually have to use them or lose them.
That's a great jumping off point. Let's talk about how we might, given the sort of non-regularity of the situation we face. So typically you might argue the reason we have emergency powers is because it's an emergency. And often what that means is exactly how COVID came onto us. It was sudden, we weren't expecting it, we weren't prepared. Just the way a flood or fire, all of these things kind of suggest something that has happened, it's a crisis. We need more command and control. Somebody needs to do something. It needs to happen quickly. We don't have time for, a ruler to be run over things. And it seems to me like that's how emergency acts are structured. But this COVID normal situation that we're about to head into, it's different because we have had quite a lot of time now to see what the crisis end of the global pandemic looks like for us, what happens with the lockdowns and all of the other things that we've experienced. And now we're about to go into a period that could be a year, it could be 6 months, it could be 2 years, until we have a vaccine. Essentially, we're going to be in a state where we're going to be subject to a different set of laws and expectations. Is now a time where we should have the kind of body that one of our viewers was discussing, that we should be advocating for there to be a more independent, arm's length kind of a body? Julian, what do you think?
I think your comments are right on the mark. We have to be very careful. First of all, we need to identify the rights that we have. And I think common sense tells us what those rights are or what they should be. We need to protect those rights in a way that is legally strong. But the same legislation or constitutional provision needs to provide for waiving those rights or suspending those rights for good reason from time to time, like, combating a common enemy sort of thing. All that said, what people don't recognise at the moment is that what the government has done is capable of being done indefinitely. They can suspend all of those rights if they want to, because they're not otherwise protected. And they wouldn't get away with it politically, so there would be a problem. But I think you're exactly right in raising the question, what happens? Do we lose all our rights until a vaccine is found or whenever? I think the answer to that has got to be no. But it worries me that if we got a government in power that had the sort of Donald Trump style aspirations, then you might find, for example, that the next emergency which is declared and against which various rights are suspended is climate change. I mean, it would be horrifying, because I actually do think climate change is a very real problem, but it would be a dreadful thing if the threat of climate change were used as justification for the suspension, or the apparent justification for the suspension of the same rights that we've seen suspended during the COVID crisis. There,
so you couldn't protest, or you
yeah,
couldn't make certain political statements.
I'd be on the other side. I'd be attacking those restrictions rather than supporting them.
I guess what I would say is that in the COVID normal, we're only part of the equation. You look at what's happening overseas right now, and many Australians have family, friends. They may have come back from Australia from working overseas. So we're only part of the solution, and we're only part of what's going to happen, because the opening of borders, as much as we might all like that, what's going on in Europe, what's going on in the UK, what's going on in the United States is really problematic. And if we're going to allow people back in, then we're going to find ourselves in yet another quarantine hotel situation. So I think that needs to be noted. And while we're likely to see freer movement between the Australian states in the coming months, I would imagine if WA suddenly got a big outburst again a lot of infections, that they wouldn't think twice about closing those borders. And there's not a lot that the federal government can do about that. It might try, but there's not a lot it can do about that at the moment. I think there's also something to be said for people are going to take their eye off the prize. And we'll probably find ourselves again in that situation where people kind of go, oh yeah, we're not very smart humans. We don't seem to learn our lessons very well. So even though we're all upset about it by now, if the footy comes back next year and we're able to mostly go back to something like normal, and the economy does bounce back to some degree, then we'll forget pretty quickly. State of emergencies and state of disasters, I've only ever experienced them before, during a coup when I was working in Thailand, when I was covering an earthquake in Padang in Indonesia, these things, or a state of emergency or martial law down in the south of Thailand or in parts of the Philippines. So, these are things that we should not get used to. And we should not allow our governments to get used to imposing them, because they should be. When I was going through I'm outraged about the curfew. The only other time I'd been subjected to a curfew was in those situations when I'm dealing with a very, very volatile situation overseas. So this is something we should not allow our governments to become. This isn't COVID normal. Imposing these kind of restrictions isn't COVID normal. The spacing out and tracking people to some degree, yeah, I guess for a while, but there are going to be concerns because the COVID app never worked properly. We've now got this QR controversy. Now I used the QR system in a number of restaurants and cafes I've been in the past week and had no issue with it. But if there were to be suddenly privacy issues, and we know that there are constantly breaches.
All right, can I just get you to explain, just for people who don't know what you're talking about, tell us about the New South Wales is just required, and that
so I'm not 100% full bottle on the detail, but the QR codes are those sort of funny square codes that you see about places that you put your phone over and that records your number and you put your name in and etc. Now, I think they want to in New South Wales make that mandatory, whereas here it's mandatory to have some kind of contact tracing. When you go to a restaurant, you might have a QR code like the places I've been to, or you might write them down. Now, write them down is probably more labour intensive for the wait staff, etc., but is low tech. As soon as you don't need it, you can throw that piece of paper away, and it's pretty safe, solid, secure perhaps. But a QR code, depending on who is holding the information. Like I refused to download the COVID app because it was being run by, the back office was being run by Amazon. And Amazon has had leaks of data in the past in the US, and I just don't, and frankly, I don't trust the government with my data more generally. So, there's my bias right there. But I think that is a huge problem. If you're going to make something mandatory, you need to be absolutely rock solid that you are going to hold on to people's data. It can't go to a third party. You can't outsource it. You need to take responsibility, because that's what happens when there are data breaches constantly. It's like, it wasn't us. We did it to the third party. So,
so this is our opportunity, it seems to me, not to forget. I think your point, Karen, is really, really important. So I feel like the people who are tuned in here today are probably the ones who, that we're all human. We do forget, we do forgive, we do understand why all of this has been necessary. But it feels to me like the people who are here today have had that creeping sense, and you're, I think, evoking it very nicely because it's making me get that creepy sense.
Sorry.
Like those kind of little incursions, how many there have been. And it's not one QR code one night. It's the fact that now you're doing QR codes and you wonder, where is this data going? Like the New South Wales government was boasting when they were advertising this new QR code for hospitality venues that it's going to be super easy because once you put your name in, every time it'll just pop up and just populate with all of your details. And I thought to myself, ooh, creepy. And it's not one thing, it's the accumulation of all these things. And as one of our viewers has said, the sense that there's nobody who is watching each of these moves and deciding, is this one justified? Is there evidence for it? Is it reasonable? Is it going to be effective? All of these sort of criterion that, as Julian rightly said, are ideals we have about the questions that should be asked. But what should we do so that we do have perhaps a movement or an idea where we should be going around this? Should we be just saying, look, it's a pandemic, 1 in 100-year event, our government's done super well, we're in a really enviable position, we're just going to take whatever they hand out for as long as they hand it out? Or should we be thinking about how to get a bit more civic control over the things that we're being asked to give up and to sacrifice?
I think we do need to keep an eye on what is being done and why it's being done. But to go back to a point that you made earlier, Leslie, I would have thought, being in Victoria, we might all have had a little bit more concern about people held in refugee camps. I mean, most Victorians have got a bit restless after a couple of months of being locked down. What about if you're a refugee from a different country and you've been in detention for years on end, and now you've got Mr. Dutton wanting to take your mobile phone away from you, and you get moved from one detention centre to another, meaning that people, locals who've learned to know you, can't visit you anymore. That's social isolation of a very high order. And
you're saying it should make it empathetic because we've experienced it now ourselves.
It should.
Right.
And we shouldn't be pick and choosing, cherry picking which rights we think are okay that we protect and which rights we don't. I'm going to get on my high horse here about the legislation. 75 to 80 pieces of legislation that have been introduced federally over the last 20 years about national security, data retention, journalists, whistleblowers, etc. We bang on about it, the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance and the Your Right to Know campaign and others. Because it's stopping us doing our jobs. It's stopping accountability of governments. It's allowing them to have secret trials. It's allowing them to do a whole manner of things behind closed doors without any light on them that, we really struggle to get people to give a damn about. So we can't cherry pick the rights that we think we should protect just because it protects us. And let's face it, most of it, now that we're, free in Victoria, we are getting haircuts, we're getting pedicures, we're having, eggs Benedict. Now, seriously, let's think about how privileged we are. I did, it was very good. But that's what we think is deprivation, and that's what we think is a lack of freedom. Getting to Julian's point about, imagine if you are away from where everything you've ever known. You've come on this horrendous journey. You keep being pushed from pillar to post. You can't get a legal decision on your case. So I think we need to really, I hate to use the word, harden up, but we need to actually be a little more understanding of what rights really are, because I think we're a bit precious.
So I've got a couple of interesting questions that have come from our viewers. One person is asking, very relevant to this discussion about refugees, so I'll put it to you, Julian, first. Should freedoms that we have or should have, should they be offered to citizens and non-citizens alike, regardless of people's residency status?
Short answer, yes. And the reason is that we regard all of these together as human rights, and people from other countries are human beings just the way you and I are.
That's something also, Leslie, that's been raised in the case of Julian Assange, for example. You know, the extradition hearings that have been going on in London is that, you know, the Americans have said that if and when they were to get him to the United States, he would not be given any of the rights, those kind of constitutional rights that Americans have. And, you know, I mean, we know the death penalty is, you know, something that is there. So we've got to actually think on a very big scale about human rights. Again, it gets back to my cherry picking. It's just like, you know, Julian Assange is not very popular for a lot of reasons, but what is happening to him and the extradition process actually ought to frighten all of us because of the concerns that it brings about how journalists are treated, how information is treated, what publication really means. You know, it's not an easy discussion, I know, and national security is one of those kind of flashpoints that has really exposed concerns. But it's one of those things when governments continually hide behind national security because they don't want us to know stuff. And let's face it, a lot of the stories that came out from that those leaks were actually really important, really very much in the public interest. We've also seen recently the ABC journalist Dan Oakes, finally the Australian Federal Police have said they won't charge him. Now, there's nothing been proven wrong in the story that he wrote. They just don't like the fact that he wrote it because he got documents.
And so already... All of this speaks to government overreach. All of it speaks to the potential and the actual experience that different Australians have had over time. Some extremely important, as you pointed out, Karen, to the functioning of democracy, like journalists. Some extremely vulnerable, like refugees. There is overreach. And I think the question that we probably, you know, need to answer in kind of our last 10 minutes is what do we, I mean, in some ways you've said, Karen, you know, we shouldn't cherry pick. And yet the whole start of this conversation was us saying, well, yes, we've had this enormous kind of overriding of our expected rights and freedoms in regard to COVID, but that's okay. That was justified, that was acceptable. So how do we know as individuals when we should accept that sometimes we do have to sacrifice certain freedoms in order to benefit everyone else or for whatever the justification is? And when should we know that this is unreasonable or it should be resisted in some way? What's the telling signs?
That's a really good question and very, very difficult to answer, but any constitutional or statutory protection of rights needs to have a provision which says in certain circumstances, these rights can be suspended. And the trick is to identify those circumstances adequately. And there will always be room for disagreement. There will always be some people who think, no, my rights are more important than the global pandemic or whatever. But, you know, if you think about individual rights, there are some circumstances where these things come into very sharp focus. You referred to national security. I agree with that as a problem. Sorry, Karen, you referred to national security as the sort of the basis on which rights can be suspended. And Bernard Callear and Witness K are a perfect example of that. But although everyone's heard of Witness K in that context, very few people have heard of the case of Witness J, who was, I think, also with the national, you know, probably with ASIS, I think. I know the guy, but I do not know his real name and I do not know who he worked for. He was secretly charged, secretly tried and secretly convicted to prison a couple of years ago. Now, the fact that we have secret trials of people is horrifying. And I don't think national security is a sufficient justification for that, because the fact that a person can be disappeared almost totally is completely unacceptable in our society.
So what's your prescription?
That's the sort of thing.
I'm going to make you king for a day. You're going to write the Bill of Rights and you're going to describe in it when they can be overridden. Go.
I think the Victorian Charter does a reasonably good job. It's limited in the rights that it can protect, but it does have provision for suspension. And if I had known you were going to ask something like that, I probably would have.
I'm just following where you're leading me.
I would just say that
Just-
communication is really important. I think that justifying it in a clear, concise, factual manner is really important. And I think the Victorian government's been successful to some degree in that, but I think that it's also had some missteps in that. I guess I would also say, again, banging on about, overreach more generally, I've most recently been a court reporter at the ABC before I left, 2 months ago. And during the pandemic, there's been a real hit and miss about journalists and the public's ability to actually observe the court cases that have been going on. I think some judges and justices have taken advantage of the pandemic to shut people out because the technology is not there, or they, whatever it is. So I think that we need to really be very careful more generally about ensuring that we go back to that you can't hide behind COVID, and you can't hide behind spurious ways to stop what are our normal rights. Because, I certainly saw that in the court system, where suddenly journalists weren't allowed to observe court cases. Many we couldn't, because they just did not have the technical capacity to do so, or because a judge decided that we shouldn't do so. So, I'm being a bit selfish on the journalist side of things, but I think that, when those in power are prepared to do overreach and who don't think that others have rights, or that they can trample on them fairly easily, I think is problematic. But I think we need to ask a lot of questions. We need to ensure that our governments are answering questions. And that, I think, is a telltale sign. If you've got a government that's not prepared to tell you why it's doing what it's doing, we need to keep probing. And then that should be a red flag to potential abuses of those instruments.
Okay, Karen, that leads beautifully into a question that someone wants me to ask you in particular, which is talking about the media landscape in general, with the whole the domination of the Murdoch press and the political position that it takes, with the diminishing number of media outlets. How do we maintain an independent media? This person wants to know.
Well, you need to pay and subscribe to the quality media. You really do. You need to support the quality media. The Guardian, The Conversation, New Matilda, some of those. The New Daily, not the Daily Mail. But, like, subscribe. If you want quality newspapers, quality journalism, pay for it. If you are concerned about what you see in other organisations, complain about it. Complain initially to the newsroom, then go, actually use your right. We also need to, that's a totally different discussion, but it's a broken model. There's no doubt that the advertising way we've been doing the media is a broken model. But exercising your right, paying for good stuff, and boycotting those that you don't like. I actually think that's a very, very effective way. Sign that petition. Well, I guess the petition's gone now, but make it known that you're not happy about what's going on. And that takes a bit of guts. It takes writing a letter, or getting on the phone, or signing up on your credit card, but do it.
And this will be actually my last question, because in some ways I have a feeling that this question about the media, I mean, obviously, Karen, you're a great person to ask it, but it's sort of connected to this idea that in some ways, given we don't seem to have a body that can look after our rights in this context, it really ends up falling to the media, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
We in some ways are advocates around asking exactly the questions you say are important. Why are you doing this? Have we got somebody in government who's standing up and asking the questions and being able to provide answers?
And I think we've seen...
The reason it comes down to the media, I think, is that most people have not the slightest idea what is going on. They have no idea whose rights are being infringed. And if you want people to develop some sort of empathy, you need to acquaint them with the problems that are happening.
Yeah, and I think that, while I think some of the criticisms of the Melbourne media have been valid, there's been some hectoring of the Premier over some issues that certainly ordinary folks didn't necessarily think were that important. But there's also, I agree with Meg Simons, who's been saying, this is just part of the way the sausage is put together. Okay, we need to be a bit smarter about how we put the sausage together. And a friend of mine said to me yesterday, some of the journalists probably don't realise is that they're all now broadcast journalists, that they're all like Lee Sales, and everybody's listening to your questions and wanting to make sure that your questions aren't biased. So, that's something that the media has to learn. But, obsessing over the hotel inquiry, I think, is actually a really important thing, because we found out that, the decisions were made very, very quickly, and there was no normal chain of events. What I think is actually has to come from this is that, to me, there's been an immense failure of our public health system. It's been hollowed out by government after government after government. We've got a brilliant medical system, a brilliant treating system, but our public health system is problematic, and that's borne out by the fact that we're still having issues with translations in some communities and communications. So I think there are big issues, as well as the civil liberties. It's actually what our expectations are as citizens and residents more generally.
Okay, that's a great place to wind up, and we are out of time. So I want to thank you both so much, Karen Percy, Julian Burnside. I wish there was an audience that you could hear clapping, because I'm sure that they would be. And thank you so much to all of you who've tuned in to this AIS presentation. And remember that there are more, that we do this regularly. And if you have any topics of concern or of interest to you, please do let us know, and maybe we can try to put on another talk for you. But for now, that's all we've got. So thank you very much for tuning into this discussion about COVID and civil liberties. I hope it was everything you had hoped for.
And can I add one thing for people to take with them?
Absolutely.
Ask yourself how you would like to be treated, and make sure that everyone else is treated the same way.
The golden rule. That's a great.
Do unto others.
Do unto others. That's right. It's a great adage. Thanks very much for that, Julian. Thanks, everyone.
And thanks to you, Leslie.
Thank you.
Thank you.